right, so the basics of urban growing. So thank you all so much for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. So as I was saying, so this is going to be a two-class series on just like just the basics. Like this is for first-time growers who just want to know, like, I just want to know how to build a garden, which we'll be talking about today, how to build it, and then next week I need to just figure out what I'm going to plant, when I'm going to plant, and how I'm going to, some tips on maintaining and harvesting. So, so we're just going to kind of touch the basics for that. And then if you want to learn more about different things, check out the recordings and stuff from the spring course or all of our summer classes and stuff. And gardening is one of those, you can keep it super simple, or you can, you could spend, all hours every day just like kind of exploring on all the possibilities. So a couple more quick announcements. If you haven't seen this already, a bunch of us put together a COVID resource page. There's a lot of COVID resource pages out there. This one kind of has jumps on, goes around. It covers a lot of different things, from gardening resources to workers' rights to things like that. So if you're, and we have a map of hundreds of different places that they're offering free meals around the city. So if, definitely check that out if you haven't, if you're looking for, help or resources or things like that. We already went over the Doug Network page, but definitely this is a big resource. There's so many great things happening in DC, and it's really hard, it's easy to miss a lot of it. One thing, we do a monthly newsletter or bi-monthly newsletter. So this is all volunteer organization. No one's making money off of it or anything. But the whole mission is just to kind of bring awareness to all the great resources happening in DC around urban ag and food security. If you haven't signed up yet, it's really long, ugly newsletter, but it's got tons of different resources. Like every 2 weeks, there's dozens of jobs and grants and workshops and things. And right now we're posting webinars. We're really focused on webinars, and there are just so many amazing webinars happening every week right now. So this is a great time to kind of focus on education. So check that out. This is that spring urban grower webinar course that we just ended last week. But if you want to catch any of these recordings and presentations and stuff, they're all up. This is the summer series. Let me know if you have any issues registering. And then last thing I want to talk about announcements real quick. So we also do a Wednesdays Ask a Gardener or Ask a Garden Expert, whatever, a Q&A session every Wednesday, noon to 1. So if you're having questions and we run out of time, or if you haven't, if you're watching a recording and you don't understand something, you could join us anytime. It's very informal. You can show up real quick and ask a question, and then jump off or stick around and listen to other people's questions. And then also there's the GC Urban Grower Network. We created a Google group. Just a lot of people are asking this. There's been a lot of groups before in the past around different, be able to have groups where you can ask questions. You can bulk purchase with people. We're going to talk about soil. Soil is expensive. That's probably the most expensive thing when you're building raised beds. But if you can have a bunch of your neighbors throw in and buy a big bulk delivery, it's really cheap. So it's just a place, a Google group that people can start connecting with. And there's a lot more of these groups out there too as well. All right, so now I'm completely done with all the intros. Thank you for tolerating that. But now we're going to kind of jump into just a couple of things, like why garden? This is a big question. Normally I survey the classes and get different reasons why everyone's here, but it's usually it's one of these many reasons. One of it, just the taste. I thought tomatoes tasted like plastic, most of my life, until I actually grew my first tomato and just realized just how amazing these when you actually grow them yourself and pull them from a vine and eat them that same day. It's a pretty powerful experience. Especially my favorite tomato is sun golds. They're like cherry tomatoes that are really sweet. And if you want a kid to get into tomatoes, give them a sun gold, and they're going to love tomatoes. Saving money, anyone who goes to Whole Foods just knows how expensive all this stuff is, so just the fact that you can, sometimes, it depends on, if you want to grow your own seedlings, you can save a whole lot of money. or buying your seedlings. It's still a lot cheaper. Just, you know, imagine like for a couple dollars and some, you know, water throughout the summer, you can, I mean, you can grow, you know, hundreds of dollars of produce from your backyard. So it's a really great way to save your money. It's a really great way to bring better access to healthy foods. You know, increasing food access, especially, you know, the healthy food access. Especially if you're living in communities that don't have, you know, healthy, you know, access to healthy groceries, you know, groceries, full service grocery stores and things like that. Just you know, saving the planet, like the huge carbon footprint. You know, we have some food justice classes where we're just talking about just a massive carbon footprint. You know, of like, you know, just having your food shipped, you know, from all over the world, you know, directly to your, you know, local store, or your front door. It's just a huge carbon footprint, as well as just like there's a lot of bad industry practices that are not only bad for the planet but are bad for workers, a lot of the food workers and animals and things. So just like we're just creating a better food system by keeping it more local. My biggest one right now is like all of us being stuck at home right now. It's you know, a great way not to go insane. It's very therapeutic. It's like one of those things, gardening, like you can just go out and water and weed for like, you know, 10 minutes a day, or you can go out there and spend hours just kind of exploring your garden and like, you know, weeding and you know, squishing every bad bug and things like that. So, especially with kids, like, we planted a bunch of strawberries and sun golds and stuff. I have a 3-year-old, and then like every day last year we went out and just like, it was just, she was just so excited to pick, you know, strawberries and tomatoes and things like that. So just you know, building, you know, like community gardens and a lot of urban ag projects really connect people, as well as on top of like youth. I mean, it's so important for youth to really understand where the food comes from, and just like an empowerment of actually like, you know, having power over your food system and having, you know, access. It's just, I mean, it's just so many different ways right now they want to garden. On top of the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic that's really stressing out our you know, food system, that you know, the more local that we can go, the more that we can grow and build, you know, build our own food systems is just so important right now. All right, so you know, so today's class, we're going to talk about, basically we're going to talk about how to build your own garden at your home. We'll talk about a little bit like on the indoor gardening, but mostly about like how to actually build it in, you know, in a garden in your yard, or a raised bed garden. So that's going to require, you know, looking at different requirements. You got to find the right spot that's got enough sunlight and drainage and water access and things. And then you got to, you know, prepare your soil, whether you're doing it in ground or whether you're buying your soil and doing raised beds. And then we'll talk about how to create these gardens, you know, how to create, you know, in-ground gardens or raised beds. And then we'll talk a little bit about design. And then next week, we'll jump into more garden design. And then we'll talk about what plants you can grow, or not next week, now on Thursday. We'll talk more about what plants you can grow, when you should plant them, and some tips on maintenance and harvesting. But the first part, you know, we need to find a spot in your, you know, somewhere in your home to actually garden. And that could be a big challenge at first. So, sorry. So the first spot, you know, the most important thing is sunlight. I mean, your garden needs as much sunlight as possible. Unless you're growing mushrooms. We're actually having a mushroom class this summer. So if you get no sunlight in your yard, or very little amount, about doing a mushroom garden. But other than that, yeah, we need as much sunlight as possible for a lot of things. But really, this doesn't mean you need to have sun on your garden the whole entire day. Really, because like in the middle of the summer, I mean, we could have up to like 14 to 16 hours of sunlight, and really like you don't need that entire amount of sunlight. You just need to capture as much as possible. So like we divide our plants into 2 different types of plants. We have plants that need we call full sun. That need about 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, and then we have partial shade plants that only need about 3 to 6 hours. And a lot of times these partial shade plants, I mean, they'll be more happier in full sun. You know, like peas do really well in partial shade, but they do even better in full sun. But they can, you know, handle the partial shade. So 6 to 8 hours, you know, like I said, like in the middle of the summer, we can, you know, the sun rises in the east, you know, travels up in the south, and then sets in the west. I mean, that whole journey could be like, I mean, it could be 14 to 15, 16 hours of sunlight. So we don't need to capture all of that. And we just need to capture about 2/3 of that. So what I say, about two cardinal directions of that. So let's say, the sun rises in the east and you get that east sun, and then but you have a giant building in the south, but then you get west sun. That should be enough sun for a full sun garden. Or let's say you get east sun, you get the south sun, but then you have a giant oak tree on your west that blocks the sun as it's setting. So as long as you're getting 2 out of 3 of these cardinal directions, you should have enough sun to do just about anything that you want to plant. But let's say you only get one of these cardinal directions. Let's say you have a building on the east, and you have a giant oak tree on the south, but then you get a couple hours of sunlight on the west as the sun's setting. So that's when you so if you're only getting one of those directions, that's when you got to think about partial shade a garden, or using some more of these shade tolerant vegetables. So we have a list of really great vegetables that grow really well in the shade. So a lot of your greens, like your chard, your kale, your spinach, different kinds of like culinary herbs, root vegetables, potatoes, radishes, legumes. So legumes are really important to try to incorporate legumes in your garden, because they're actually they're called nitrogen fixers. They actually suck nitrogen from the air and deposit it in the ground. It's really cool. So having some kind of peas or beans in a portion of your garden and moving that around your garden every year will actually start refertilizing your garden. And then like currants and gooseberries. So gooseberries grow really great in this area. I used to grow a lot of blueberries, and blueberries are really sensitive. They need really acidic soil, which is hard to produce unless you keep them in their own container on their own separate garden. So all my blueberries, we just couldn't keep them alive. So I replaced them with gooseberries, and they do really well, and they're super delicious. Do much better than blueberries. But then, like, let's say you get like maybe like 4 or 5 hours, but you still want to do like tomatoes and peppers and stuff. Like you're not into all this stuff. Or there are little tricks that you can do to kind of increase that amount of sunlight. Well, one, you want to figure out how much sunlight you have. So if you want to get exact, this is a great time while we're home. You just just check once an hour. If you see sunlight in the area that you want to do a garden, and just go out there every hour, set an alarm, and then check and count how many hours. And let's say you get like 5 hours of sunlight, but you really want to do a full sun garden. There's certain ways that you can increase that amount of sunlight by reflecting that sunlight. Because the leaves on your plant, they'll absorb chlorophyll, whether it's on the top of the leaf, the bottom of the leaf, the front, back, all that stuff. As long as that sunlight is just getting bounced back and forth and hitting that plant, it's going to absorb that sunlight. So maybe planting your garden on the south end of like a white wall. So then that sunlight's, it's going to hit the front of the plants, but then it's going to hit that white wall, bounce back, and hit the back of the plants. And that may get you an extra hour of sunlight. Or some people will do reflective, it's called reflective mulch, where you lay down this like aluminum foil or mylar, poke holes. And then that, the sun's hitting the top of the plants, but then it's hitting the reflective mulch and bouncing back and hitting the bottom of the leaves. And that's going to add, additional sunlight. And so that's a way to kind of like cheat a little bit and try to squeeze off a full sun plant garden in case if you're not getting enough sunlight. If you want a really great place, mylar is like the most reflective surface out there, and a really great place to find a bunch of free mylar. It's not happening this summer, but if you go to like a marathon, at the end of the marathon, there's like they give everyone, they run it like a mylar blanket to kind of warm up. It's one of those like fire blankets, and then they just leave them in this giant pile, and you can just grab as much as you want. Okay, having troubles with webinar. Just a second. Um, apologize. Just a second. The chat box just kind of disappeared. I don't know where that box went. Okay, sorry. Yeah. All right. So let's get the. All right. Sorry. Sorry how the chat box disappeared. I wasn't seeing if there was any questions. So going back to there's a couple questions. Do partial shade or even full shade plants suffer if they have over 10 hours of sunlight? Um, Usually not. Most, plants that can tolerate partial shade will be happier in full sun. Um, Trying to think if there's any like different ones, but most of these plants up here, they're going to be happy in full sun. One thing though, we'll talk more about this on Thursday, but so a lot of these things, greens, we only plant greens in the spring and the fall because it gets too hot for them in the summer. And they'll bolt and they'll get bitter. But a lot of things but a lot of ways that people get around that is they plant greens, like lettuces and stuff, like kind of like they give them a little bit of shade. You're a shade cloth. They plant them behind a row of tomatoes or something like that, and that if you keep them somewhat shaded and water them heavy, you can grow greens all summer long. Like chard does really well in the summer and things like that. So there are reasons why you may want to give things partial shade, mainly because they'll get too hot in the summer. But for the most part, though, everything on this list is going to be really happy with full sun. Yeah, especially even over 10 hours of sunlight, they'll be really happy. You just may need if you get too much sun, the only thing you just may need to water a little bit more, just to make sure things don't dry out. Is it too late to plant lettuce? Yeah, unfortunately, unless we'll talk about certain ways that you can do it. Like if you give it a little bit of partial shade and water it, you can plant lettuce as a summer crop. But it's too late to plant it as a spring crop. And we'll talk more about that on Thursday. But it's possible. And like I said, things like chard and collards do really well in the summer. They just get a little bit more bitter because they get that's the only problem. Like if you plant chard and collards in the spring and the fall, they're more sweeter, and then over the summer they'll survive and do well over the summer. They just get a little bit more bitter because of the heat. I saw it and they were asking if it's too late to plant lettuce. Yeah, I would say unless you plan on giving it a little bit of shade, it's too late. What about black-seeded Simpson and romaine lettuce for planting now? Yeah, I would say the same. For Thursday, we're really going to dive into what to plant and when on Thursday for the Thursday's class. So we'll dive more into those questions later. All right, so let's say you found a spot that has enough sunlight. So now the next step is figuring out how's the drainage in this spot. So so this is there's a drainage test you can do. It's basically you just grab a shovel and dig. It's supposed to be about a foot hole, but it could be just the size of the shovel. You fill that completely up with water once to kind of prime it, then let it just drain once, so maybe come back, the next day, and then fill it back up again. And you can, you can get technical about this, and you can get like a tape measuring, and you can like monitor how low it drains over, timing. But basically, or you could just come back in like 3 or 4 hours, and if there's still water in that hole, that soil it doesn't drain very well. Chances are it's either been a backfill. It could be like when your house was built, it was a lot of backfill. It was compacted really tight. In DC, we have a lot of clay soil. And that's the problem with clay soil. Is it has a lot of great nutrients, but it's just not, it doesn't drain very well. And all plants need good drainage. If it doesn't drain very well, like the top of the plant, absorbs carbon dioxide and all that stuff. At the bottom, the roots actually need oxygen. And if you flood the area of water, it pushes out the oxygen and will actually kill your root system. So you need to have fast, draining. Technically it needs to be 1 to 3 inches per hour. But if you come back in a couple hours and it really hasn't moved that much, that's not a good place to do at least an in-ground garden. But there are some options. Let's say you have bad drainage. Well, the easiest option is just to build a raised bed. We'll talk more about how to build a raised bed and in a second. But that's the easiest option. Then you don't have to worry about, remediating your soil and things like that, and then we're finding a new spot. But another thing, there's a thing called double digging where there's like YouTube videos and stuff about this, but essentially double digging is where you want to till 2 feet of soil. So you dig up the first foot, and then the second foot you just take like a rake, like a garden fork or a pitchfork, and just kind of stab it and break up the second foot, and then kind of mix it all up and mix compost. You only do it once, with a new garden. You don't do this every year, but that could add, some better drainage for the area. But you got to do it in a large area. If you do it in a small area and then you have like clay all around, you could be creating kind of a swimming pool where all the water drains, rushes to that area. So it's tough. When you have bad drainage, it's really tough to kind of remediate the area. But you can also, you could just build your garden up. Let's say if you're doing in-ground garden, you don't want to spend all the money for wood. You just try to get your beds, at least a foot tall as possible. And we'll talk about ways to do that in a second. Another way is you can do like French drains and stuff. That's where you have these like pipes, perforated pipes. You dig trenches, you lay them in, put gravel, and all the water will accumulate in this pipe, and then the pipe takes it to another area, like to a sewer or a rain garden or something. So there's a lot. Even like capturing excess water. If you have a lot if it floods because all the water from a roof is like flushing down to this one area, you can try to capture it in the rain barrel and things like that. But the easiest way is like either like if you have really bad drainage, I would say either you're going to do a raised bed, or you're going to find a different location to host the garden. So someone's asking, when is a good time to plant beets? So beets are spring, stuff. So spring and fall. So yeah, you kind of miss your window for beets right now, but you can definitely plant them for a fall crop. We'll definitely talk on Thursday. We'll talk more about timing of when to plant what. All right, so let's say you find a spot that has good sunlight, and then you find a spot that has good drainage, or you're saying, hell with it, I'm going to do a raised bed. So now you got to make sure you have access to water. So easiest way is have a water spigot close by. A lot of places, like a lot of our community gardens and stuff, and they get water from rec centers. They have these special spigots on the outside of the wall where you need like a water key, which is just like this weird little like ratchet kind of thing that opens up your water. But a lot of times, a lot of community gardens and different sites, they don't have access to water. So then you have to figure out how to get water. One of the best ways to do is anytime you actually dig in your yard, like deeper than a foot, if you're planting a tree or something like that, if you're double digging, anytime you're planting something that's deeper than the foot, you're supposed to call Mist Utility. It's a free service, and they basically, and they're pretty prompt. You call them out, and in a couple of days they'll come out and they'll spray paint or put flags all the utility lines in your yard. And like, blue would be for water, green sewer, yellows for gas. This is really nice just so you don't plant a tree, on top of your gas line or something. So it's really good to call this line whenever you're doing any kind of, serious digging. But also you can kind of discover if there's a blue line, then that's a water line that you can actually, it's a little expensive, but for a couple $1,000s, you can tap into that. Get a spigot, get a backflow preventer, a water meter, and that could be your water source for your community garden. Rainwater is a great way to water your garden. You really need a big surface though to collect a lot of rainwater. Like I see a lot of rain barrels on these like little tiny tool sheds, and that's great, but you're not going to get enough water from a tool shed to water all summer long. You need like a big house, or just a house or a building or school or something. And the thing you want to be careful when you're collecting rainwater is if you have asphalt shingles. So they have there's a lot of kind of like heavy metals and stuff in there, and it's only bad when it kind of chips and deteriorates a little bit. So when it's called the first flush, when it first rains, for the first couple of minutes, it could flush some of that loose heavy metal stuff, and which is not the worst thing in the world, but you just don't want that accumulating. So if you do have a rain barrel and if you have asphalt shingles, one way you can avoid that is it's called a first flush system. It's where all the water from the roof comes running down to your instead of going directly into the rain barrel, it goes down this one pipe, and then the heavy metals and stuff are like rest on the bottom, and then clean water fills back up and goes back in your cistern. So you can YouTube this. I mean, it's pretty easy to make, but if you do have asphalt shingles, I would recommend doing a first flush system. And there's another system that some of our gardens, use where they can actually, like, community gardens can tap into hydrants, get meters from DC water to actually run, fill up cisterns, and then they can use gravity fed and stuff like that. But for most of us, we're just going to be, we're just, focusing on, if you're home gardens, you probably have some kind of spigot or some kind of rainwater, system. All right, so hopefully we found a spot, that has, good sunlight, that either drains well, or you decide to do a raised bed, or we have access to water. So as long as we have these three things, we're ready to go. We're ready to start working on actually, prepping that soil and then building the beds. So the first thing you want to do, so if you're growing in your ground, like an in-ground bed, it's a good idea to do a soil test to try to figure out what's happening in your soil. If it has the right nutrients, if there's toxic things. The biggest thing is the acidity level. Acidity levels measured by pH levels. It's a system that goes from 1 to being like straight up battery acid to, I think it's like 12 or 14. I think it's 12, but and that's like your base. That's like bleach. That's probably the most important thing, because everything else, like you can figure out ways around it if you're lacking nutrients, if you have some like contaminants, things like that. There's solutions, but a pH is really hard to change. What we found is there's a sweet spot with pH right in the middle, and that's really important, because most plants, if it's too acidic, they have trouble absorbing nutrients, or if it's too alkaline, they can't absorb nutrients. So you may have tons of nutrients in your soil, but with regards to acidic, your plants aren't absorbing anything. The sweet spot is basically 5.5 to 7 is what you're looking for. This is a really confusing graph, but basically it's kind of showing that between 5.5 and 7 or 7.5, that's like where most of your nutrients are absorbed really well by plants. And a lot of times you can tell, based on what's already growing there. Like if you ever notice, like some houses have nothing but moss, like growing on your ground, that's because things are too alkaline. And there's probably like 8 or 9, on the pH scale. Or if it's too acidic, you may not have much growing at all. Maybe grass, struggling. But if you have nice healthy grass growing or other plants, there's a good chance that you're in this in this sweet spot. But other things that you're looking for is like micronutrients. Macros, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Like it's like 3 main nutrients that you need, and then micronutrients are like just a wide variety of like calcium, magnesium, things like that. You can test on how much organic matter you have, and then there's like contaminants and things like that. So how do you test your soil? Cool. So we're actually going to talk a little bit about so how do we actually do a soil test? It's actually easier than it sounds. You don't need that much equipment. It's great if you have one of these like soil probes, and we have a tool share that's closed during COVID, but when it opens back up, you can actually grab one of these and you just shove it into the ground, and it gets a nice cross section that you can test. But really, you just need like a shovel, a bucket, a tarp, a plastic bag, and a Sharpie. The idea is, you want to test each unique area of your yard. You don't want to, like if there's one side of your yard, it's like, sunny, there's healthy plants, everything looks great. There's a little bit of a forest. And then there's another side that's like gets runoff from your street, runoff from your house, maybe it's just like nasty things. You want each like section. You don't want to do one test that covers your entire yard. You want to do each unique area needs its own test, because there's probably different things happening in those unique areas. And like for each unique area, ideally you want to dig like 5 to 15 holes, depending on how big it is. But just to get a couple holes, if it's a small area, just a handful of holes. And you want to dig the holes like very similar to like the drainage test. You want the hole to be like the size of the shovel, about foot deep. And then what you're doing is you want to get that cross section. Like basically what a probe would do. Because there's different levels of soil. You want to capture all the levels. So you want to cut the edge of that hole and get just a little sliver. And then you want to pull off the grass, rocks, any trash, anything that's not soil. You want to pull out and then throw that in a bucket. And you want to do that, like 5 times. Just, I mean, if it's a big yard, 10, 15, but small yard, like just a handful of times. And then you put it all in your bucket. You mix that bucket up really well. I usually dump it on the tarp and let it dry out a little bit, then mix it up a little bit more. And then really you just want like a small cup's worth, so you just want to get like a cup worth of the soil that's been mixed up and dried out. Dump it into a little plastic bag, use that Sharpie, right? Especially if you're doing multiple tests, right? Immediately, right? This is from this section because you will confuse it later. I've done that before. And then you mail it to one of these labs. And there's a bunch of labs in Virginia, University of Mass Amherst. UDC sometimes does soil testing. I don't believe they're doing soil testing right now. It all depends on like when they can find funding for the soil lab. But you send it out to them. There's even a couple like soil microbiology tests that will places that will tell you how much good biology is in your soil and stuff like that. We're gonna have a microbiology class this summer to learn more about that. But really like just send it to one of these labs. And like it depends on like sometimes some of the tests can be like $10, $15, $20. Some of them can be like $40, $50 depending on what you're testing for, the heavy metals and stuff. And then they respond really quickly, and a lot of these labs are open right now. They have been deemed essential. So then usually within a couple days they'll email you the results. And these results, I mean, they could be pretty overwhelming. It's just like, what is all this? But don't let it there's only really a couple things you're looking for on these soil tests. You're looking for the soil pH, the acidity of your soil. So if you look at this is 5.6. So that fits perfectly in our 5.5 to 7 buffer zone that we have. I mean, like you can check out your nutrients and stuff, but that's really easy. I mean, just adding compost and things like that is going to help with your nutrient levels. And so mainly you want the soil pH, and then you want to look and see if you have any contaminants. So lead and arsenic are the two big ones in this area. And lead and arsenic actually occurs naturally in our soils. So it's okay to have some. Don't freak out. Every soil has some. You just don't want to have it above certain levels. Like lead, you don't want to have it above 300 ppm, which is parts per million, or sometimes they do milligrams over kilograms. Yeah, you want to have it below 300 parts per million and arsenic below 20. These are natural levels. If it's higher than these levels, then it's probably something unnatural, like some kind of we used to put lead in gas, and so a lot of runoff from streets, has would be full of lead. We used to have giant piles of like coal in our backyard. That used to leach off different, chemicals and stuff. But if you look at, so that's mainly what you want. You want to know the soil pH, and you want to know the lead, or if there's any toxins. And then it usually gives you some suggestions too, like, if it's too acidic, or, add this or that and things like that. Let's see. So a couple questions. Does adding lime where there is moss make soil less acidic? I believe adding lime, it makes it less acidic, so it raises higher. So actually, if there's moss, it's already too alkaline. So you actually want to make it more acidic. We'll talk about that in a second, too, as well. But you want to add sulfur or like pine needles and coffee and stuff. But really, pH is so hard to change. Like it takes decades to change your pH. So whatever pH you have, that's probably what you're going to deal with in that area. I mean, if it's like a little bit off, like let's say it's 5 and you want to get it to 5.5, you can add coffee grounds, you can add, sulfur and things like that, But if it's like 4 or like, 8 or 9, like you just got to find a different spot or do a raised bed. It's just so hard to get pH, out there. Change it unless you're doing, unless you got like a decade to kind of like slowly change it. Where is arsenic level in slide? So the arsenic level, I mean, so I don't see it in this testing, but arsenic levels, you want to have it below 20 parts per million, is what you're going with arsenic. And how often should you test the soil? You only need to test once, because your soil is not going to really change much over time. So you only need to do this once, and then you're good to go. And if you're doing a raised bed, you don't need to do this at all, really. I mean, it might be good to do it. A lot of times, like for the contaminants, it's not so much that your tomato is going to pull up lead and then store it in your fruit. It's not. I mean, we have a lot of studies that show that a lot of plants don't actually absorb a lot of these toxins. It's more about when on a dry day and like your soil dries out and you kick up some dust and you inhale that's like more the issue with like leads and arsenic and things like that. And if it's like if there's too much lead or too much arsenic, I mean, things just aren't going to grow. So that's like another good indicator. So if you, I mean, it's a good idea to always do soil tests, but if you're doing like if you're just like, man, this is too much, I don't want to deal with a soil test, just do a raised bed. But if you are growing in the ground, it's a good idea to do a soil test. All right, so now let's say, okay, say we found a spot. It's got lots of great sunlight. It's got really great drainage. It's got water access, and we just did a soil test, and it's pretty good soil. Let's say there's no contaminants and the pH is fine. So now we're ready to do to start prepping our garden. Getting our garden ready to actually start planting some things. And then and this is for in ground, and then we'll talk about in a second. We'll talk about raised beds, but let's say we're still doing our garden in our soil in ground. So we want to till it up and then add compost. So compost is something you want to add every year to your garden because it just does so much. It adds like nutrients. It builds soil structure. Like if you have really sandy soil, you have great drainage, but it won't hold on to nutrients. So it'll add nutrient retention. If you have like real clay soil, it has lots of nutrients, but it doesn't drain very well. So adding compost and mixing that up will actually add porosity and then add drainage. So it's just something that you want to add every year to your garden. Usually right before you plant a garden, is when you add compost. But you can also top dress later and things like that, which we'll talk about in a second. But adding compost, so there's really two options when you want to prep your garden. You can either till or non-till. So till is like the traditional way. So let's say it's like area. It's like maybe 10 by 10 foot area in my front yard, and so I'm just going to what I'm going to do is you want to cover the whole area with a couple bags of compost. And then I'm just going to get a shovel. I'm going to get some hose, I'm going to get some cultivators, whatever. And I'm just going to mix everything up as much as possible. It aerates the soil really well. It mixes up the compost, so there's like there's your good organic matter all over. And it just gets the garden really ready to start planting some plants. But then there's a non-till version. So you see this here a lot more with like permaculture and more like forest gardens and things like that. So this is where instead of like mixing up your soil so much, you just aerate your soil. So you still cover your garden full with compost, a couple bags of compost, spread it out. And then you grab like this is a broad fork or a pitchfork and just kind of poke holes into your garden. Kind of wiggle it back and forth when you poke your hole. So you're just creating these, it's called vertical mulching. You're creating these like holes all over your garden where the compost kind of naturally just like it kind of seeps through. So there's pros and cons for each one. Like the pros, like if you're just doing mainly, I think the best thing to understand the pros and cons is understand annuals versus perennials. So annuals are things that you plant every year, and they usually die if it gets too hot in the summer, or they die when the winter comes. But then you have to replant them every year. So that's like your tomatoes, eggplant, lettuce, all that stuff. But then perennials are plants that grow and they survive every year. So they can live a couple years, decades, a long time. And those, you don't have to plant every year. They establish themselves really quickly. But So those things are like your berry bushes, like your your perennial herbs, like if you're going to do sage, lavender, thyme, oregano, and things like that. So like if you have a lot of perennials, then you don't really want to like rip up your garden every year because you're going to disturb a lot of their roots. And at the same time, when you have a lot of perennials, there's a thing called exudates where the plants suck up carbon from the air, and then they use a lot of it to grow parts of their plants, but then they seep out in the soil like nutrients, like sugars and carbs and stuff. It's called carbon sequestration, but they seek out. It's called exudates, and it actually feeds the biology in your garden, and then you can actually produce really healthy soil biology, like healthy bacteria and like funguses and stuff like that. So, and every time you till, you kind of rip all that up. So it's really you got to decide: do I want to mainly do a lot of annuals, or do I want to do a mixture of annuals and perennials, or you can also do both. Like my garden is I have a perimeter of berry bushes and herbs, like perennial herbs and things like that around the perimeter, and then in the middle I'll do some tilling in the middle, and that's where I plant my annuals, like my tomatoes and peppers and things like that. So it's really like it's up to you whether you want to do more of an annual till garden or more of a perennial non-till. But I think it's just starting out. I would recommend just maybe starting out as a till garden. The main thing is you want to get compost in your garden every year. And it's just like when you till things, it's just so much easier to work with the soil. It's just, I mean, plants like are happier. I would recommend starting out with a till, and then as you start adding some perennial plants and things like that, you can kind of incorporate non-till areas and things like that. So it's really like it's up to you and your preference. But like I say, if you're a beginner gardener, I would just till everything and then add compost, and then just that's the easier way. And then slowly think about adding non-till and things like that. Um, So question, where can I find compost? I drove to Fort Taunton's transfer station yesterday and they're closed for COVID. So that is like, if you go to the Doug Network website, there is a whole page called Gardening Resources during COVID. And they'll list a lot of like, almost every, I'm pretty sure every garden store, every nursery and hardware store is considered essential. And they all have compost. Yeah, but you can buy it by the bag. If you have to buy a lot though, it can get expensive. So there's some garden centers that will deliver in bulk. That's a little bit cheaper. But yeah, some of the transfer stations, like the Fort Taunton transfer station, you can actually drive down and they collect the street leaves and they send them up to Pogo Organic up in Virginia, and then they make a composting mulch that you can pick up for free. But some of those spots are probably closed during COVID. But I was hoping not to pay. Yeah. So there is a list on the Doug Network of just if you go to the Garden Supplies website, there's a whole list of places that have free garden supplies. You can check that out because there's other transfer stations in Arlington and Tacoma that may be open. And it's usually free to pick it up, or if you can pay to have it delivered. So check that out as well. Okay, so Carol, is compost just from leaves? No, compost. So it's really important. So it's the difference between soil and compost. Soil is like rocks and stuff. Over thousands of years have broken down to this very stable structure. And then compost is like an amendment of just broken down organic material. It could be leaves, it can be food scraps, it could be anything organic. It kind of breaks down into this organic amendment that's basically just feeds your soil, adds some soil structure, things like that. But the problem with compost is it disappears really quickly. So in your garden, so you have to add it every year. Every year, plan on adding a couple bags of compost to your garden. And you can mix it up and till it in the beginning in the spring. And then if you want, you can add a couple bags and top dress it, where you just lay compost, on the top, let it slowly seep in, around your plants. But all right. So then, like for talking more about fertilizers and organic versus organic. A lot of times compost and fertilizers and amendments are kind of, interchangeable a little bit. But the main thing that we really want to push is if you're going to get into fertilizers and things like that, you want to avoid the inorganic ones, the ones that, are multicolor, made in labs, a lot of like Miracle-Gro and things like that. Because the problem with that stuff is a lot of times they're too high in nitrogen, and nitrogen is what builds leafy green growth. So your plants will grow really quickly on the top, but then a lot of times it grows unhealthy. It grows too quickly. It could be too much green growth. It could be bad for like fruit production. It could just be too much for the roots to handle, and then your plants start getting weak. And then once you have weak plants, you start having diseases and pests come. So and at the same time, like this stuff is like, it doesn't absorb and it doesn't in the soil very well. So if it rains, it will wash off into our water systems, and then we have algae blooms and all kinds of bad stuff. Yeah, try to stay away from inorganic stuff and try to just add organic material, whether that's like compost, maybe manures, or different like fish fertilizers and stuff like that, because it stays in your soil. It doesn't wash off, it bonds with your soil. It's low nutrient release, doesn't overwhelm your plants with too much fertilizers. I mean, it's just so much better doing organic. So organic, so these are the amendments I would recommend for organic gardens. Really, all you really need to do is just add compost. That's usually enough. If you don't want to, deal with all this other stuff, just adding a couple bags of compost every year will be enough to grow anything that you want to grow. But then if if you have some other things, compost tea, you can YouTube this. It's where they get some, they get some finished compost. They put it in like a pantyhose and then put it in a bucket of water, get like a $10 aquarium pump, add some molasses and then pump it up for like a couple, a day or two. And it creates this probiotic spray that can like, add all kinds of beneficial biology to your garden. Compost and manure, like if you want to pick up, like Rock Creek Park stables, and DuPont, stables. If you're getting manure, you want to get it from like either buy it from a store in bags or get it from national park stables, because a lot of times like like other horse stables will have they'll use herbicides on the feed that they feed their horses, and then that herbicide is persistent. It'll survive the stomach, it'll survive composting, and then you're putting herbicides in your garden. National parks are 100% organic, so you can pick up compost from these stables or manure. So compost and manure is just manure that's been sitting for a year. It's kind of broken down, or it's been composted through a compost system. You don't want to add fresh manure to your garden. It's too high in nitrogen. It's too salty. It'll dehydrate a lot of your plants. You want to only add manure that's been sitting around for like a year or so, but that's a great source of nutrients for your garden. And then like if you want to fertilize throughout the year, you can get kind of crazy into like different kinds of fertilizers and stuff, but I recommend if you want to just not think about it, I have my go-to fertilizer. It's called Neptune's Harvest. It's a fish and seedweed fertilizer. It's just got everything you could possibly need. Like fish fertilizers are great for your NPK, your nitrogen, your potassium, and your phosphorus. These are your three main ingredients. Like nitrogen grows leafy growth, potassium, helps with flowers and fruit production, phosphorus helps with root production. But then there's all these micronutrients like, calcium and magnesium and things like that. It's just too much to like keep track. But seaweed and kelp have like a great deal of micronutrients. So I just get this this Neptune's Harvest. It's got it's fish and seaweed fertilizer. It's awesome. And now you just put like a cap full into a watering can, fill it with water and just water it, throughout your garden. And it's just a great, boost of nutrients. But the thing is, you want to be careful not to over fertilize. I probably I'll fertilize maybe once or twice a year. Because if you over fertilize, what happens is you start accumulating salts in your garden. It starts what happened next, and it just starts It's just bad. Yeah, you don't want to over fertilize. You don't want to like. So if you are going to fertilize, you want to maybe do it once a year, maybe twice a year, and then that's it. And that's all it really your plants really need. But honestly, if you just want to go easy route, just add a couple bags of compost and don't worry about all this stuff. Compost has everything you need. But if you want to give it an extra kick, think about like adding some fish fertilizer. Manure probably okay with University of Maryland. They give you gloves and all you need. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, if it's from a university, I would expect it. It's definitely from it's organic. Um, let's see. Another question: does it have to be compost with leaves plus grass? No, compost can be anything. I mean, you go. I mean, there's a wide variety of compost depending on how much you want to spend. Um, So some, like you go to your hardware store, you'll see some of the cheaper composts, like Leaf Grow is a very cheap compost. This is made from street leaves, but it's good. It's got good nutrients and organic matter. You can get mushroom compost is another cheap one. Most of the mushrooms are grown on the country are grown in Pennsylvania. Um, so crap. Oh no, the audio. Okay, sorry. Audio gone again. Okay, sorry about that. Man, Web. Yeah, I'm sorry. The WebNext is just the buttons are terrible. All right, so I'm going to start that over again, just in case. I just explained the different levels of compost, but there's a lot of cheap compost like leaf grow and mushroom compost. Mushroom compost comes from Pennsylvania. It's like most of our mushrooms are grown in Pennsylvania, and they're grown on wood logs and things and sawdust and stuff, and then they compost that and make a cheap compost. Or leaf grow is like from collected street leaves, and they compost that, and so both of those are really great. Those are your cheap route, um, your cheap your compost, and then they make compost and manures and more expensive stuff, and then like they're really nice, like there's like a one from Maine that compost like lobster shells and stuff, which has tons of nutrients like macronutrients, but it's like $15 a bag. So it's really just depends on how much you want to expend in. There's nothing wrong. I just go cheap. I mean, like really, like you're fine with the cheapest stuff. But if you want to add some different nutrients and stuff, great. But like cheap, cheap is totally fine. So you said if the compost has just leaves, is that not only carbon with no nitrogen like you would get in grass? Yeah. So if it's just leaves and stuff, it just takes longer because nitrogen is what really attracts the bacteria that initiates all the compost processes. So yeah, you might not have all as much nutrients as like a food a food compost, but it's still good compost. It's still good organic matter. It's still going to add nutrients and soil structures and stuff like that. So it's really up to you. If you got the money, go for the great stuff. But I mean, I just go for the cheap stuff, and it seems to work fine. All right, so now that whole section, we're wrapping up the section on soil prep. So hopefully you tested your soil, you found some good soil, or you have bad soil and you're just going to do a raised bed. And now, we figured out how to we amended the soil with some good compost and things like that. So now we're actually going to create the beds. This could be actual structures of raised beds, or we're going to create the beds in the in-ground bed. So you don't need wood to actually create raised beds. Raised beds is any kind of soil bed that's kind of raised from the garden. That's typically what you want to do if you're going like an in-ground garden. Ideally, I mean, you can't always do this, but ideally, you don't want like a garden that's just completely flat, because then if it rains, it's just going to flood and it's going to be tough, for things to grow. So what I really like to do is I get a hard rake. So not to be confused like a leaf rake, like a hard garden rake, and I'll use that to kind of just scoop up and make these raised bed mounds. And the idea is even that you make these rows that are about ideally you want to get them about a foot tall, and then with and about maybe 2 to 3 feet wide, and then like a foot long, a walking path, and then another bed. Um, that's ideally what you're trying to do if you're doing a raised bed, in ground. You still want to have beds that are raised. You just want kind of use a hard rake to get them up, and you want to you want it to be on contour lines. Like if you got a bit of an angle in your garden, you don't want to plant your garden bed along the downward slope, because then when you water everything, it's just going to all wash down the side. You want to find contour lines. Contour lines are when everything's level in the hill, and you want to plant your beds along that contour line. The easiest way to kind of see that is just get one of these. It's just a couple dollars, like the string level, where you tie a string on a stake on one end of your yard and then to another, and you attach this, and you can move around and just kind of see where your angle is. Most gardens, I mean, most yards aren't that bad of an angle, so it's not the biggest deal if it's a little bit of angle. But if it's a really bad angle, you might want to think about doing terrace gardens, where you get make it get some wood structures and actually make level beds on the side of the hill. But for the most part, I mean, if it's just a slight angle, you don't have to think about it too much. Just kind of do it what works best. And then it's ideally to have good paths. I sheet mulch my paths, meaning I put cardboard down on my paths and then put wood chips over them. So that way you don't, because you don't have to deal with weeds that are grown in your paths. Some people will see white clover in their paths, and that will keep weeds from growing out. So yeah, but so there's pros and cons between doing in-ground gardens versus raised beds, which we'll talk about raised beds in a second. The pro of in-ground gardens, a reason why a lot of people like in-ground gardens like this as opposed to raised beds is, one, you can grow a lot more food on an in-ground garden, a lot more food than raised beds. And it's a lot cheaper. We're gonna go over some pricing in the raised beds, and I mean, you may have to drop a couple $100, to do some raised beds. So, and this is basically, add some compost, buy a couple tools, and then rake your beds up, and then plant right into it. So that's your pros, but your cons is it's a lot of work. A lot of work, especially these national parks has 7 or 8 community gardens in DC, and their plots are anywhere from 15 by 15 to 40 by 40, and it's just too much, especially if you're a first-time gardener. Just dealing with the weeds, dealing with the maintenance. It's a lot of work. So if you it's not too bad if you're doing a small little garden, but if you got 20-foot by 20-foot area, I probably would garden and raise beds for a couple of years, kind of learn some things, and then take it over, because it's a lot of work. So your pros are you can grow more food and it's cheaper. The cons are you're going to put a lot more labor into a garden like this, and it's going to be dealing with a lot more issues like flooding and things like that. All right. So someone said, yes, please share where to get free compost. So if you go to the Doug Network, .org. There's there's a COVID page, and there's also a garden supplies page, and you could find somewhere on that garden supplies page. There's a whole section on where to find free garden resources. So if you can't find it, just send me an email, and I'll share the link. How tall should my seedlings be before taking them outside? When should I plant them in my raised beds? Um, it's not really so much about how tall they need to be. Basically, they need to have a solid root ball that you can pull. You can pull the whole root ball out, and it stays together. But most important is it need to have the right temperatures and the soil temperature. So for like, we're real close right now to a summer garden, like most of your warm weather plants, your tomatoes and peppers. And we'll talk a lot more about this on Thursday, but we're real, the ground needs to be about 70 degrees soil temperature, which is different from outside. The air temperature may be 80 or 90, but it takes a while for the soil temperature to actually warm up. So last time I checked it, I mean, we're in like mid 60s, so we're real close. So usually people wait till about mid-May, and mid-May is like a good time to start planting your warm weather stuff. If you have cool weather stuff, you can plant that anytime now. But we'll talk a lot more about that. And when should I plant them in raised beds? Well, let's go to the raised bed section, because raised beds, yeah, it's just the same. I mean, I would wait to mid-May before, unless you have stuff that like cool weather stuff. So you have two options, like I said. You can either grow in the ground and then plant whatever which takes a lot more labor, but it's cheaper and you can grow more. Or you can build raised beds, and this is a great way to start off. If you're new to growing, this is a really great way to start growing, especially if you don't have a lot of time. But it does cost. You're going to have to pay some money up front to build these, and we'll talk about pricing and stuff in a second. But some of the benefits is, one, you don't have to ever worry about flooding. So when there's going to be some period every summer where it's going to be like a week or two where we just get flooded out with rain. And then like the gardens that are in ground, a lot of times, I mean, like they'll get completely flooded and they may lose a lot of plants. But then raised beds, they're happier than they've ever been, because they have good drainage. They're off the ground. You can't overwater these guys. It'll just drain out. You could choose exactly what soil you want. I used to do like 50% topsoil, 50% compost, but then the compost will disappear after a year, and then I'm left with, I have to refill the bed. So now what I do is I completely fill them up almost to the top with topsoil, and then I just add a couple bags of compost and mix that in. And then every year I just, add a couple more bags of compost, and that works way better than having to like refill this thing halfway with compost every year. It's great. It warms up quicker in the spring because it's outside, of the ground. It's just a lot more accessible if you have mobility issues, or if you just got, don't want to kill your back. You could build them where you can actually sit on the side of them and do your gardening. There's a lot of great, like the tabletop ones are great for people in wheelchairs. There's a lot of really great things about raised beds. So there's a question. I have a rain garden, so my yard floods. Will this keep it separate? Well, rain gardens a lot of times will help, deal with it. It will help, with some of the flooding, but a rain gardens can only capture so much water. And if it's a real bad flooding, they'll overflow. So hopefully you have an overflow. But if you don't, and then if it's a real bad flooding, but yes, it will help somewhat. It will help with your flood, your yard. Another question: do your raised beds get too full with soil you add each year? No, you can't. I mean, you can't overfull. You still want to like mix them up and till them and stuff. You don't want them. They make it compacted over time, so you want to kind of till it up a little bit. No, I mean, I just keep it mostly full with topsoil, and then I just add a couple bags of compost every year, and then that works really, really well. All right, so building. We're gonna have a couple slides on how to actually build raised beds. Typically, people, most people build them out of like 2-inch boards. That's like the minimum you want to build them. I've seen people build them out boards that are 1-inch thick, and they don't last more than a year or two. So you definitely want to have at least a 2-inch board, and you want to have it at least a foot tall. A lot of people, I mean, if you're going for cheap, you know, you want to buy like 2x12 boards, like 2 inches thick and 12 inches tall, and then like, you know, that's typically what people do. Or you can also, we'll talk about doing, you know, building out 4x4s and 6x6s and stuff like that. And typically the dimensions is you don't ever want it to be thicker than 4 feet. So if you see this little, you know, one dash is for feet, two are for inches. So this is inches, this is thick, is feet. And then no longer than 8 foot. So people basically build them 4x8s are the standard size. And that the reason why you don't want to have it more wider than 4 feet is because if it's like an 8x8, you can't reach the things in the middle. With 4 feet, it's going to ensure that you can reach everything really easily. And then 8 foot, you don't want to have it longer than 8 feet because it will start bowing. Unless you're making it out of 4x4s and 6x6s and stuff like that. But if you're making a typical raised bed, you're typically going for 4x8s or smaller. You could do a 4x4, 4x6, but 4x8 is mainly the size that you're going for. And then it really helps to do put some corner pieces, like get some, you know, like 2x4s and chop them up, or get some tree stakes and chop them up, and then put these corner pieces. You don't have to you don't have to actually like stake them into the ground. You just want to get some, you know, small pieces of wood in the corners, and then screw those in, and that's going to keep it much more structurally sound. It's going to not fall apart so easy if you have these corner pieces. And then I definitely recommend, before you fill it up with soil, if you have clean soil, just like tilling up your soil and then adding the soil on top, and that's going to give you a lot of root growth. We got a question: what do you do to protect your garden plants from being eaten by deer, rabbits, and other animals? So that's a big question. We actually have a whole class on dealing with garden animals. That you should definitely check that out, because there's a lot of things you can do depending on what the animal is. Like deer, we find that there's these motion sensor water sprays that work really well. Like the deer crosses the laser, it will spray water at them and freaks them out. Doing a perimeter of like really smelly herbs like lavender and sage will oftentimes mask the food smells. That will help out a little bit. But a lot of it's just like, you know, building like cages over your garden, and we have a whole, you know, class on how to build cages. So you can definitely check that out. Let's see, a couple questions. Where does the compost disappear to each year, since you say it does not overflow? Yeah, so the compost, it just breaks down to almost nothing, or it's used up by plants. You know, I mean, it doesn't break down to nothing. It just breaks down to basically like the very small soil particles or whatever. Yeah, well, not. I take that back. Not for very small port. You know, it just disappears. It's the easiest way. Because compost, I mean, it's stable, you know, but it's still breaking down. It's being used. Soil biology eats it up. You know, plants eat it up, and it just kind of disappears every year. So that's why you got to add it again every year. It's basically you're adding the plant food. You know, the fertilizers. What is soil conditioner? So soil conditioner is like compost. It's another word for compost. Soil conditioner is some kind of, it may be different things. It may have different nutrients, but most of the time it's just compost, or it's mixed with something else. That's good. It's like you definitely want to read what it is. Sometimes they mix it with like, probiotic funguses like mycorrhizae or different things like that. But soil conditioner is good. You definitely want to read it first, make sure it's not like a miracle grow, like inorganic thing, but most of the time it's good. Why tilling before filling? Yeah, so ideally most plants want at least a foot of tilled soil. And they'll grow well if you can just give them a foot. But if you can give them 2 feet of tilled soil, they're going to be super happy. Like tomatoes are just fine with 1 foot, but if you give them 2 feet, they're going to be super, super happy. So this just gives you an extra foot of tilling, of nice tilled aerated soil. So you till that up on the bottom, and then you still want to fill it up. You want to fill your beds completely full to the top with soil, and then ideally that would give your plants 2 feet. But it's all right if you can't do this, or if you have bad soil. if you have toxic stuff, maybe it's a good idea to get some landscape fabric and cover the bottom, and then put the soil over. But yeah. Can you build raised beds on wooden patios? Yeah, but I would recommend if you're doing wood patios to do containers, and we'll talk about containers in a second. I probably wouldn't do raised beds on a wooden patio or a concrete pad. I do wood raised beds over just soil. You can do it. It's just that you're going to have some drainage issues. You got to do some extra things. I would recommend containers. We'll talk about containers in a second. So you have a couple different options when you're building raised beds. You can do untreated pine. That's your standard. So there's wood is either treated or not treated. So it's either kiln dried, which is like they chop it up and they just dry it up, which is untreated pine is kiln dried, or they have what's called pressure treated wood. That's when you see like the moist wood that's got sometimes got green tint to it. That they under pressure they inject it's a fungicide copper basically, and they inject copper into the wood to keep it from rotting. And that and they use this what's called MCA, micronized copper azole, and it's it's approved by the EPA. A lot of people don't mind it at all, but it's not considered completely organic if you use this wood, because a little bit will leach off into the soil, which it's not the worst thing. It's not going to kill you. It's not going to destroy your soil biology, but it's just not organic. So that's why like if people use pressure treated, they may want to some people will line it with like landscape fabric, keep a barrier between your soil and your wood, but it's really not a huge deal. It's just your personal preference. But some reasons why you use treated versus untreated. So untreated pine, if you use 2-inch thick wood, is going to last you about 5 years. And then it's going to rot, and you're going to have to replace the wood, which isn't a big deal. It's not a whole lot, the main cost you're going to see is the soil. So it's just like an extra $50 of wood to like replace everything. Treated wood is going to last, 2 to 3 times as long. So maybe you're going to replace these boards every like 10 to 20 years. So it's really up to you, what preference you want. Do you want untreated, and then you be organic, or pressure treated, and it's personal preference. But then there's cedar, which is basically the best of both worlds. It's organic, and it has a natural fungicide, but it's super expensive. So it's really up to you. I mean, it's like 3 times as expensive as this wood. So, but it'll last just as long as pressure treated wood. So I mean, if you're looking for a long-term investment, think about cedar. And then my personal favorite is if you can afford it, to do like build beds out 4x4s and 6x6s. So this will last like 50 years. They're really easy to put together, and you can actually sit on the sides, and actually do your own gardening on. This is the main thing that we build at our DPR gardens. So question: if you use cedar, can you use boards thinner than 2 inches? I wouldn't recommend, because cedar, it will buy you some more time, but just that 1-inch board, I mean, it's too thin. It'll deteriorate too fast. You can, it's just you're gonna have to replace it after a couple of years. So I might as well just do the 2-inch boards. But all right, so here's some pricing, and then we'll get into actually how to build some of these. But the pricing, so there's a lot of words on this. I don't need to like dive into it. This is more as a reference point. And then wood prices change every month, so you have to actually verify these prices and call and check on the websites. But these are general prices that I got out from Home Depot, I think like last summer. And the idea, you can see like if you're building like 2x12s with 2-inch boards, I mean, it could be $40 a kiln dried wood, $50 a pressure treated wood, or $160 a cedar. And then if you're doing like 4x4s, it could be $90 or $450 a cedar, and then 6x6s, it could be $150 a wood. So it's really, it's different pricing depending on what you want, like how big of the pieces you want, what material you're using. But and then there's some pricing with hardware. Hardware is like the screws that you need to like put everything together. But really, what's going to break your bank is the soil. The soil can be pretty pricey. So if you're making a 4x8 foot bed that's a foot tall, you need 32 cubic feet of soil. So when you buy a bag of soil, it's usually like 1 cubic foot or 1.5 or 0.75, depending on the bag. So that means you need if your garden store is only selling 1 cubic foot bags, they'll say on the bag. That means you need 32 of those bags. Or if it's like 2 cubic foot, you need 16 of those bags to actually fill up your garden bed. So that's when it can get kind of pricey, buying all these like, individual bags is actually a pain in the butt to move everything. So that's when bulk comes in nicely. Bulk you can get, it's usually $20-$30 a cubic yard, but then there's like $150 delivery fee. But if you can get like 5 or 6 neighbors to throw in on it and just get one bulk delivery, and it'll break down to be a lot cheaper. But and then like and then adding a couple bags of compost could be like an extra $20 or so. But so all of this, I'll let you. This is just for your reference. I'll let you guys kind of figure out what kind of beds you want. But I just want to kind of show like the cheaper end is you're going to be spending about $150 for a raised bed. That's for the cheap end. And then the more expensive end, I mean, you want doing 6x6 cedar boards, it could be up to like $1,000. So that's one of the reasons why people just do gardens in beds, because maybe they don't have that, or they don't want to spend a couple $100 to build the actual raised beds and fill them up with soil. But this is just a reference point just to give you kind of idea of the pricing. So hopefully this will kind of guide you towards whether you want to do raised beds or not. But you also have to think long term, like these things are going to last long. The more money you spend, the longer they're going to last. Like our 6x6 beds are going to last 50 years. So I think it's worth spending a couple extra $100 a bed. But then but that's only if our project has the budget too as well. Right. So actually building raised beds as well. So so when let's say you figure out like you figure out how you're going to build your raised beds, you're going to do 2x12 boards. You're going chief, foot tall, 2 inches thick. So now we want to actually put them together. And so we have a whole class on carpentry, but this is just a quick summary. Basically, when you build your bed, don't build your bed on top of a bumpy yard. You want to find a very flat surface, like a sidewalk or a driveway or something. Because if you build it bumpy, it's not going to come. It's not going to be what we call plumb. Everything's not going to fit together very nicely. But you find a flat surface. Put the boards together. On the flat surface. It's really great to have. This is called a speed square. To make sure you have like 90-degree angles in each corner. You could put them together. I like the serpentine pattern. You don't have to use it, but this way it's like a perfect box. But you can fit them together however they fit. And then get a couple screws, screw them in. If you're using kiln dried wood, pressure treated wood's really nice because it's moist and it doesn't crack very easy. And you could just screw screws in directly. But if you're using kiln dried or non-pressure treated wood, I would recommend pre-drilling, where you drill the holes first with using a drill bit that's the same size or smaller than the screw, and then screw them in so you don't crack your boards. Get some kind of corner piece like 2x4s, for each corner. Add a couple extra screws. That's going to secure it really well. And then just do that for every corner, and then you have your raised bed. Then pick that up and bring it to your garden, unless your garden surface is really, really flat. So this is the easiest way to kind of just really quickly put a raised bed together. It shouldn't, it's pretty easy. And then if you want to do 4x4s and 6x6s, so this takes a little bit more. It's just a different kind of way that you build beds. You don't have to worry about bowing or corner pieces or anything like these. You can make these things as long as you want. You can have them like you could be 4 foot by 20 feet. Because they're so stable, they're not going to bow or anything like that. But we still, typically like 4x8s is what we do, and mainly you just need what they're called timber locks. They're these really big screws that you need like a powerful drill, like 18-volt or higher, and then you just screw in, like if you're doing 6x6s, you would get 8-inch timber locks and just screw them together with timber locks. On the sides and then on the top if you want, just to secure everything. Or you can drill a large hole and actually hammer in rebar and things like that. But that's a lot more work. I just timber locks work really well. And I really love these beds. Like I said, I mean, you're going to be spending a little bit more money on your wood, but it's just so nice. Our typical standard is we buy 6x6 pressure treated wood. When we stack 3 of them high, which is 18 inches is a good bench height. So if you can, if you have mobility issues or you want just like a nice leisurely garden, if you can get it, 18 inches tall, and you can actually sit on the sides, and it's just super easy to garden. So I really, really like these beds a lot. And they're much more long term. I mean, these things are going to last 50 years, so you never have to worry about repairing them or rebuilding them like you would like 2x12s. All right. So a couple questions. If you use cedar, can you use boards? Oh, wait, no, we already did this question. So, and then if you want to just get away from the typical wood structures, there's a lot of alternatives. You can buy these plastic recycled lumber, which is like recycled plastic and wood kind of mixed together to make these long lasting boards that should last like 20, 30 years. You can order them as a kit. They build really nicely. They last a long time. They are a little flimsy. They bow a little bit. But overall, it works pretty well. It's a little pricey though. You can use steel. A lot of our beds will make a wood frame and then have steel sides. That works really well. The thing about steel is it heats up in the sun, so which is fine. It just means you have to water more. It'll dry out a little bit quicker than normal wood. You can just go, if you got some, you can just use logs, leave the bark on. That will keep it from, breaking down. So that works really well. I really like concrete block raised beds. Don't use cinder blocks. Cinder blocks are lighter. They mix in fly ash from like like it's like heavy metals from a coal plant. Because it's made to be construction materials. So make sure you get concrete blocks. That's safe, and then you can leave the holes open, fill it with soil, and these persons planting garlic around there, or put some a nice paver stone top, and that's a nice little bench that you could sit and do gardening. So there's a lot of options with raised beds. If you want to check out some of them, we actually this is my favorite community garden that we built a couple years ago. It's at Langdon Community Garden. It's in Ward 5. It's next to the Chuck Brown Memorial. Or at least it's like a block from the Chuck. It's in the same park. It's a long park. But we actually did 6 different types of beds. We have like concrete beds, metal beds with wood frames, plastic recycled lumber, this artsy kind of like glass bottle one, which I don't recommend unless you got a lot of money and time. And then we have cedar beds, and then pressure treated 6x6s with a landscape barrier. So if you want to actually see these and how they're doing, you can actually go out to this garden and check out some of these raised beds. But so there's a lot of options. So you can do some research. If you're not sure, maybe just go cheap. Like 2x12. Untreated wood or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely. I mean, yeah. And you don't need to get it right this year. You can have different years, and you can improve your gardens and things like that. So then we have a couple other options too, like container gardens. So we have a whole class on container gardens that's pre-recorded if you want if you're more interested in this. This is great for like patios and things like that, where you don't want your soil just like seeping through everywhere and just messing everything up. And so if you're going to do a garden on a patio or a porch, or if you have a balcony or indoors, we'll talk about indoor growing in a second. Container gardens are really great. And it's also low maintenance too. Like this is a good way, like a beginner step. Like if you don't want to like go crazy like preparing your yard, for a garden, or if you don't want to spend hundreds of dollars on wood, this is a good first step kind of gardening thing. Container gardens. So a couple of tips on container gardens. This is just a brief summary, and then but if you want to do this, check out our 2-hour container garden class. There's a lot of great information on that. But mainly with container gardens, you want to be intentional about what you grow. You want to look for varieties that are like short and stout and like bush-like. So there's different varieties, terminologies. There's like dwarf plants or smaller plants, the determinate plants, There's two different kinds of tomatoes. There's indeterminate tomatoes. It's a tomato that just keeps on growing until the winter comes. So those get like 6, 7 feet tall, like the sun golds. And then there's determinate tomatoes that are more bush-like. Those are for your more of your canning tomatoes, like Roma tomatoes. So because they all ripen at once, and you don't even need to trellis them. They only get like 3 or 4 feet tall. So those do really well in container gardens. Patio varieties or bush varieties. So like peas and beans, there's vine varieties and then there's bush varieties. Get the bush varieties if you're doing containers. And then don't be confused. There's a lot of with the baby varieties. You'll see like baby eggplants. That's still a normal size eggplant. It's just like that. It's just smaller fruit. Um, and also you can do a lot of perennials like this is great if you want to do blueberries because you can make the soil really acidic. You could do, your herbs, thyme and stuff. I have like a small lemon tree and a lime tree and then and the lemongrass herbs. So a lot of these things for like perennials, you want to, especially ones that don't do well in our winters, you want to bring those inside into your basement and just let them go dormant. Like I let them dry out and then I bring them in a dark basement and just don't water them all winter long. And they'll go dormant, and then in the spring and bring them back outside and give them water and stuff, and then they come back alive. So and a lot of things are only annuals because the winter kills them, like pepper plants. But I mean, if you could bring them inside, if you could put them in a container and bring them inside, they'll keep on, surviving. Like pepper plants is a really great example. Pepper plants, if you grow a pepper, it's going to die when the winter comes. But if you put it in a container and bring it inside and let it go dormant in the winter, it'll come back next year. And I know a lot of my friends have like 6 or 7 year old pepper plants. So it's a really great way to kind of like extend. I mean, eventually they get weaker and weaker and unhealthy. But for the first couple of years, I mean, you get a lot of peppers. But definitely look for those varieties. For containers, you need to give, if you're doing small things, you can do small containers for like small herbs and strawberries and lettuce and spinach and things like that. But for most plants, they need a good frame of reference is like they need a 5-gallon bucket to grow. So a 5-gallon bucket is about 1 foot in diameter and a little over 1 foot deep. That's a perfect size to basically grow anything. If you could put a tomato in here, a green pepper, things like that. Bigger things like summer squash and artichokes, they may need a little bit bigger of a container, but that's a good frame of reference. So if you're doing like, you have a container that's smaller than a 5-gallon bucket, herbs, strawberries, lettuce, spinach, but anything, this size, like a tomato needs at least 1 foot in depth and 1 foot, diameter to grow really well. So yeah, these buckets are really great reference point. And then the types of containers you have, like black containers, heat up and dry out. So, maybe find, I avoid black containers because they absorb that heat. Terracotta, that's the clay containers. Those are really great. They're cheap and they're porous. They actually let, if you can't, it's hard to overwater. They'll sweat out water. But if you leave them out in the winter, the water in the pores will freeze and they'll break the pot. So you want to bring those inside. And then if you're doing like, DIY, like if you're doing like repurposed, 5-gallon buckets and kiddie swim pools and all different kinds of things, you want to use, plastic has those like, symbols, there's 7 different types of plastic. Use 1, 2, 4, and 5. Because 3, 6, and 7, that's like your PVC and your styrofoam and things like that. They leach bad stuff. So avoid that stuff. Soil, you don't want to just throw a bunch of normal garden soil in there because it gets too compacted. You want to use like potting soil and there's like 1,000 different ways to make your own potting soil, like compost, vermiculite, and like peat moss or coconut coir. It's really recommended to avoid peat moss all possible. Peat moss is a non-renewable resource that comes from bogs that not only is we're about to run out of peat moss someday, but also it's really important with climate change. It sequesters a lot of carbon, so we're really not doing any service doing that. So coconut coir is like it's the same substance, like it does the same job, but it's from the husks from coconuts. So try to get coconut coir at all possible over at peat moss. Drainage, you got to make sure it's got to have really good drainage. If you don't, drill some holes in the bottom. And then if you're doing like, big plants, you want to do support systems like trellis. If you just put a trellis on a bucket, like if it gets windy, it may knock over. So you want to give it extra support. Or if you're doing like indeterminate tomatoes or sweet potatoes, this is really cool. Like a lot of people will either drill holes in the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket or just have it grow over. And then they just let it hang. I had a buddy, he lived in a 3rd-floor apartment, and he just he grew all his tomatoes. He just hung them out of his window, and then when he was ready to harvest, he'd pull them in, grab a couple of tomatoes, and then leave them out. So this is a really cool way to grow long stuff like sweet potatoes and things. You just like hang them from buckets. So a couple questions. Yeah, the slides. So there's actually a link to the slides in the chat box. So go up the chat box a little bit. There's a Google Doc with the slides for today's slides. Did you say that lemon or lime trees can be kept in dark basement over winter and just go out in the summer and produce? Yeah, so anything that, a lot of tropical plants that can't survive our winters. So that's, containers work really well with them. Like, I have a lemon and lime tree. Lemongrass. Lemongrass is a tropical perennial that will die in the winter. So banana trees, things like that. So you grow them, and you got to have a decent sized bucket, at least 5-gallon or bigger, and you grow them in there during spring to fall. But then when it's frost is coming, I bring them in. I let them kind of dry out, and then I bring them inside into a cool, dark area in my basement, and they'll actually go dormant. I don't water them, just let them sleep or whatever, and then in the spring, I'll slowly bring them back out. You have to harden them out a little bit, bring them outside for a couple hours, over a couple of days, and then and water them, and then they'll come back to, and start producing fruit. So yeah, that's a great way to kind of do tropical plants. I have a raised garden bed with half compost, half soil. Can I not use that for my container herbs, basil and oregano? No, that's great. A half compost, half soil that should do it. You just don't want to have 100% topsoil because it will compact over time and it won't be very good for drainage. Where can I find coconut coir? Almost every garden store or hardware store should have coconut coir. It usually comes in these solid blocks, and you have to rip them up and moisturize them a little bit. Can I place broken clay pieces or stones in the bottom of my pots for good drainage? So I would only do that if you have really bad drainage. That can help out a lot. But if you're using good soil, or we call it soilless media, we call it media, soilless soil. If you're using good, potting soil, and you have good a pot that drains well, don't do that because it's just you're just losing some of your root space, and you don't need it. Only do that if you have a bad soil or a pot that doesn't drain very well. That will help out. Let's see. Oh, so I joined late and don't have initial chat. Can you reshare the slide link? I'll do that towards the end, or let me see if I can. Let me see if I can find the. Okay, I'm resharing the slide link now. So all the slides will be from that link. I have a lemon tree, and I have been bringing it inside and keeping it watered over winter. Is this bad? I mean, I wouldn't water it. I mean, you can, a lot of people will bring them inside, and if you want to bring grow lights and things like that, you can keep it growing over winter. If you have, grow lights or a south-facing window and water it, that's fine. I just, but I just let them go dormant. So if you want them to go dormant, don't water them, and then that will, it's just easier that way. But if you want to keep on, if you want them to keep on producing fruit, water them and give them some light and things like that. Okay, yeah. So Jessica, you just said you went to Doug Network, and there's not much for free compost even on the map link. Okay, so remind me towards the end, after this presentation is over, I'll pull it up. And I'll show you exactly where all the free resources are. Yeah, there's not a whole lot, but there are a couple free resources. I just don't know if a lot of them are probably closed during COVID. But remind me towards the end of the presentation, and I'll pull that up for everybody. All right. So and what another good thing that's great about containers is you can actually grow indoors. So let's say you don't have a yard, You don't have, balcony spaces, rooftops, you can't get into a community garden. So your last chance, your last, option is actually, you can actually grow a lot of these things indoors. I definitely would recommend, following the recommendations for the varieties, like definitely, dwarf, determinate, patio, bush varieties is what you're looking for. Herbs are probably the best thing to grow indoors. Herbs on the windowsill in like a pot, terracotta pot is like the easiest thing. But you still need enough sunlight. You need like a south-facing window. And even that south-facing window during spring and fall, because the sun's actually lower in the sky and you get less sunlight, it's still going to be a little bit struggling. But during the summer, south-facing window is great. But most herbs can tolerate partial shade, so they're fine. In the spring and fall. And if you have an east-facing window or west-facing window, you go to that shade, that one of those first slides with the shade-tolerant plants, and you can try those. But it's still tough. But at the same time, if you need more sunlight, there's different ways you could do that. One is just like get a piece of cardboard, wrap it in aluminum foil, and put that in the back of your plants. And that, so not only is the sun hitting the front, but it's also getting reflected backwards, and that's going to increase your sunlight. You can get grow lights, like shelving and different grow lights. If you do grow lights, make sure it actually says grow light or aquarium light or plant light, because normal lights don't have the full grow spectrum. You need to make sure you have like actual grow lights. And then that you can supplement it with grow lights. We have a whole class on indoor growing and propagation and things where we talk all about like how to grow things indoors with under lights. So you can check that out. It's recorded. Yeah, south-facing window is really the best. I mean, you can grow a lot of things on a south-facing window. And I really like this. Like people actually create shelves around their windows and things like that. But really, just pots on the windowsill is great. Rotate. It's nice to have some kind of circulation, like a rotating fan. You don't have to leave it on all the times, but maybe turn that on once a week or once a day for half an hour, just to kind of circulate things. Keep any kind of like mildew and stuff like issues down. Or if you have like natural circulation in your house, like central air or something like that, that will help out. Try to open the windows in the summer or during the day. Just give it some circulation. Watering, make sure you have saucers. Make sure you're capturing all that water, and make sure you know how much to water. It's really easy to overwater and then have all water just spray everywhere. So really learn how much what to water, and try to not to overwater. And that's the number one way people kill houseplants is they overwater them. You ideally want to let your plants, the soil dry out, and then you rewater it, because it's like because when it dries out, it actually sucks oxygen into the soil, feeds your roots, and then you add water, and then that water pushes the oxygen out. But if it's always wet, those roots are going to rot. So you actually want them to dry out. Not too long though. It's a delicate balance, but you want to let it kind of dry out for like maybe a half day or day or something, and then before you rewater. And it's always good to do a finger test. Put your finger in the down into 2 inches in the soil. If the soil's still moist, don't water it, because you're going to overwater it. Overwatering looks a lot like underwatering, and that's what happens. People freak out and they think they're underwatering, and they drown their plants. You want to make sure it's a decent temperature, 65 to 80 degrees, so maybe you don't want to heat your house really high, so maybe find like on top of a refrigerator or radiator or something that's already hot. But also, if you're using windows and your windows are really drafty, get that plastic. Maybe plastic up your window, because especially if you're growing in the spring and there's a frost and your window gets really cold, that could really damage these plants. So. And then a couple of things to think about with pests. One is whenever you're bringing plants indoors, always thoroughly check, look under each plant, under each leaf, and make sure there's no bugs, especially like aphids and whiteflies and things that we'll talk about on Thursday. You don't want to bring those into your house. So you want to make sure you squish everything you find. And then a really common pest in houseplants are these fungus gnats, these little gnats that deposit their eggs in the soil and then fly around. So they're easy to get rid of. Those little apple cider vinegar. You make a cone, paper cone, put it in the bottle and put some sugary juice, and they fly in. They can't get out, and they're easy to get rid of. But if you're having that issue, you can actually get gravel mulch. Mulch it with some gravel, and then bugs don't lay their eggs on gravel, and that's a great way to kind of deal with any kind of pest issues. So a couple of them. Any tips to get rid of ants in indoor pots? I heard cinnamon. I heard they hate cinnamon. Maybe like powder, put some powdered cinnamon into the soil. A lot of times, I mean, if it's bad, you just kind of you could just, if you don't have a plant in there, or maybe you could transplant the plant and then just dump the soil, let it dry out, let ants leave, and then put it back in. But try cinnamon. I heard, never actually tried it, but I heard cinnamon works really well with ants. So south window can get a lot hotter than 80 degrees in summer. Yeah, so you definitely have to be a little bit conscious, like on really hot days. You don't want to overcook your plant. So that you just kind of have to monitor it, and you'll get the hang of it as you do it. Yeah, if it gets too hot, maybe bring the pots down during the. I mean, it's really like that around noon. That's when it gets the hottest. So you maybe during that time you want to bring your plants down, or take them away from the window. But for the most part, they should be okay. But yeah, it's good to monitor that stuff. All right, so the last part. So it's almost one, but since we're recording, I'm gonna go ahead and finish this presentation. So we just have a couple more slides, so we'll probably go another 10, 15 minutes, and then I'm happy to stick around and answer anyone's questions. I'll show you some more links on the Doug network to find different supplies and stuff like that. But if you gotta jump out, no worries. Like I said, I'll have this recording up probably by tomorrow. It'll be up on the website. So we're just going to talk a little bit about like how to set up your garden, and then next on Thursday we're really going to dive into actually how to design it based on what you're planting and things like this. But we're just going to talk about setup for the last couple of slides. And the first one is like orientation, like how are you going to orientate your garden, when you plant it with the sunlight. So remember, the sun rises in the east, it travels around the sky in the south sky, and it sets in the west. So typically how you plant your plants is you want to think about stadium seating. You want to do some kind of, if you want all your plants to get equal amount of sunlight, plant your small plants in the front, medium size, in the middle, and then tall plants in the back. And that should ensure that every plant gets, the proper amount of sunlight. But there's, we talked about this a little earlier, like, so a lot of times, like, like greens grow best in the spring and the fall. I mean, it gets too hot, and a lot of times they'll bolt and they'll get bitter. But a lot of people still, want greens in the summer. So some tips on how to do that is like maybe you reverse this. You plant your tall plants in the front, and then like tomatoes, and then plant a couple rows of greens, lettuces, and stuff behind your tomatoes. And so you don't want to completely shade them out, but you want to give them kind of partial shade. And that way it'll keep them somewhat cool. So hopefully you'll get, you'll be able to harvest. A lot of people they're able to harvest a lot of greens all summer long. Like I said, though, regardless, they'll be a little bit more bitter. I mean, they're still good. It's still worth it, but they're not as sweet as spring or fall greens. Yeah, Carol. So yeah, we are. Thanks for reminding. We also do a Q&A session every noon to 1 p.m. So every Wednesday. So we'll be doing that tomorrow. So if people have extra questions too, they can join us in. Windbreaks. So it's okay. It's a really good idea to get some kind of windbreaks, especially if you're growing in the fall and in winter gardens. We'll talk about winter gardens next slide, but it's just nice. A lot of times wind, especially in the winter, but really throughout the wind, I mean, wind can really damage your garden. So it's nice to have something to kind of break up that wind. I mean, you don't have to. You want some wind, you want some circulation. Like you don't want to like completely stop the wind, but it's nice to kind of break it up a little bit. Having like wicker, fences and nettings and stuff and things, or low like straw bales to kind of like just kind of chop up the wind a little bit. What I do is I plant a perimeter of perennial plants. So on the outside of my garden, along the perimeter, I have like perennial berry bushes and perennial herbs like thyme and like yeah, or not basil, like rosemary and sage. And then that then I plant all my annuals in the middle, so that so the wind kind of breaks up a little bit. And yeah, it breaks it up a little bit, so my annuals really aren't hurt that much by wind. I mean, you don't have to go too crazy, but it's just nice when possible. Give it, kind of break up that wind a little bit if you can. And then if you're looking for a good place to garden, like putting your garden on the south side of a structure, like a south side of a house, south side of a fence, that would protect it, especially if you're doing like fall and winter gardens. That would protect it from because the winter winds come from the north and they're really harsh, and that's really what kills a lot of our winter gardens. And then the last thing we'll talk about is deciding how you want to lay out your garden. And there's basically two different kinds of like thoughts. Rows versus what's called square foot gardening. Square foot gardening is like really cool beginner thing approach. I'll talk about in a second, but a lot of people do rows. And you could try to eyeball rows, but I mean, it's funny when people eyeball them; they're kind of all over the place. So, I really recommend if you're planting rows, just get some like some twine, some stakes, and just plant, just stake out your rows with a line, and then plant along that string line, and that's going to be you're going to have really nice straight rows if you do that. Make sure you put like pops, label it. You can use these plastic labels, and you can actually use a razor blade, and you can shave off the top, so you can reuse them over and over again. You just shave off the surface of that, and you could shave them off like dozens of times before it starts to break. And then this is a great time too if you want to try to find the contour lines and getting one of these like levels on your string will help you. If you and then planting along the contour lines helps a lot. And then when you're planting, it's nice to stagger the rows. The big idea is you want to try to ideally you don't want to have a whole lot of soil space that's exposed. So you want to kind of like take up as much soil space as possible. So if you plant them in like perfect little boxes, you have a lot of open space as opposed to staggering the rows where they fit in really nicely. But then there's this cool concept called square foot gardening. This is a really great for like a beginner gardener. I think after the first couple of years you do it, people usually give it up and they just kind of garden on their own. But this is great to kind of help people understand the spacing issues. The idea is you divide up your garden using string or pieces of wood into square foot blocks, and then using like their measurement recommendations, you could put in different types of like one cabbage will fit into a square foot block, or 9 green bean plants, or 1 pepper plant, or 4 lettuce heads. I mean, they kind of over generalize. You have to trellis a lot of things, and sometimes you have to like give it more. Sometimes you have to give it 2 blocks or 4 blocks for like artichokes or summer squash. But it's a nice way to and there's some great measurements, like these are all the things that need 1 square foot. These are things that you could fit 4 of them. 9, 16 carrots will go into a square foot, and these are the things that need a lot more space. So I mean, it's a good way to kind of start. I'll show you some examples. They just they cut everything up by string or landscape fabric or something. But I started out doing this, and then it really helped me kind of understand the spatial issues. After about the second or third year, I got rid of it just because I appreciated it. I learned a lot, but then after a while, you kind of understand things on your own, and you don't need this. It's kind of like training wheels a little bit of for spacing issues. All right, so that concludes the first basic gardener class. So like I said, we spent this class mainly just talking about how to build a garden, where to put it, and how to build it. And then the next class, this is the class I find more exciting, is we're going to talk about the types of things to grow, when to plant them, how to plant them, and how to harvest them and maintain them and things like that. But here's some really great books if you want to read more about the books. And yeah, for sure. Now stick around for another like 10 or 15 minutes and answer like questions. Or I'll show you in a second. Yeah, I'll show you where you find the free. Yeah, I'll just pull that up real quick. So for the free resources, um, Oh man. All right, so this is the dog next website. So we go with gardening resources for COVID. You'll see see which plants to plant now, or which ones to wait for a couple weeks for the summer plants. But you can see like different, um, places to find seedlings and things like that. But if you go to this will actually take you to another website, the general garden resources. So this is our garden resource webpage before COVID. And we try to update ones that which ones are open, which ones are delivering. But there's a whole section called free resources of garden for garden supplies. And so there's these 4 places you can actually pick up free compost. I don't know if they're open or not. Someone just said Fort Totten's transfer station isn't open. It's not the best at compost, and sometimes it's mulchy. It's not halfway broken down, but it's free. In a lot of places like Tacoma, if you pay them, they'll deliver it to your house. There's horse stables that you can pick up, different age, manure and things like that. And then like if you're looking for like free garden supplies, like Craigslist and Free Cycle, it's a great place to find tomato cages, trellises, bamboo, things like that. And then there's some like shared resources, places to get free plants, seed companies. A lot of times, seeds are only good. They can only sell their seeds the same year that they produce them, because the germination rate, the rates of that, how they actually grow, will go down a little bit, whether they germinate or not, every year. So they can't technically sell them. So most seed companies will have warehouses full of last year's seeds. And if you write to them, or email them, they'll usually send you free seeds from last year. Sometimes you have to be a part of a school or nonprofit, but most of the times, sometimes you have to pay for the shipping, but most of the times they'll give you the seeds. They may not be the most popular seeds, and you may want to put 2 seeds per hole because the germination rate is going down a little bit, but it's a great way to get free seeds. But yeah, I mean generally those are the sites I know about. If people know about other things to find, other ways to find free resources, definitely let us know, and I can share those as well. But that's what I got so far. So a couple questions. The permanent markers wear off. Do we wisely buy the markers that are used on cows' ears? That is the animal cow. I don't know about that one. My Sharpies tend to work. They tend to stay for. I mean, I guess they eventually they don't work very well. But yeah, I'm not sure about that. Maybe if you want to send me an email, I'd love to see what the markers those are. In the previous slide, was that corn growing very closely together? Don't think I had a slide. Let me pull that up real quick. Oh yeah, like you're talking about right in here. Yeah, it does look like corn that's growing. Yeah. Um, yeah, corn. Usually, you want to space corn like a foot apart. And corn's a tough one to grow, and just because corn, I mean, you only get 1 to 2 stalks, ears per stalk, and they take up so much room that most people, I mean, it's just you need a lot of land to really make growing corn worth your while. And plus, if you're in a community garden, I grew corn in public plots for a while just to kind of show people, and someone would steal them, like before they were. I never actually got to harvest them. So corn's a little bit tough. But we're going to talk about tips on how to grow corn on Thursday for sure. Um, the oh, please